very, very warm welcome to this very promising and wonderful evening that marks the release of an incredible book, The Heart is Noble. I don't know how many of you have been able to lay your hands on it, but it is a wonderful articulation of His Holiness the Karmapa's ideas, and as he has often said, that while he is 26 years old in this incarnation, it represents the accumulated wisdom of 900 years. There are so many elements in the book that are diverse, and they draw upon Buddhist philosophy, but they are tailored to respond to contemporary issues, ideas, and predicaments that make them enormously accessible. It is also the writing of a young mind which very remarkably is able to respond to the kinds of issues and agendas you would not normally assume sensitivity to for someone who leads a relatively, at least physically, cloistered existence. So there are the most incredible, how do I put this? I was going to say ruminations on love, on unemployment, and of course his great passion, issues of the environment and vegetarianism, two aspects that he has been very passionately promoting. But as the evening evolves, our distinguished discussants and readers and the chief guest Aruna Roy, Pavan Verma, Vandana Shiva, and we're delighted to welcome Mr. Wajahat Habibullah, will in due course elaborate on what they take from the book. So I am, in this brief introduction, delighted to welcome our speakers and to express our deep appreciation to His Holiness for being here this evening. And to set the evening off, may I invite Caroline Newberry from the publishing house to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Very practical, very simple ways that can be incorporated into our everyday choices change the world around us. Whether that is, as you say, choices about what we eat, what we buy, or just how we interact with those near us. It is based on centuries and centuries of age-old truths, but is something that also, as we say, is rooted entirely in the contemporary world. It discusses current environmental problems, increasing consumerism, and with particular timely relevance, women's rights as well. It sees the world through a lens of interdependence of all things and shows how it's possible for absolutely everyone to have an impact on the social and environmental problems of today by changing their actions and attitudes. By all of us opening our hearts to the shared connections that we have in the world around us, it really is possible to change the world from the inside out. Shambhala is incredibly honoured to be publishing His Holiness's book. They actually have a long-standing tradition with the Karmapa lineage. The first book they published was actually from a close student of the 16th Karmapa, and they have published 100 books specifically on the lineage and Tibetan Buddhism. So therefore, on behalf of them, we really wish to congratulate His Holiness on such an important and profound work, and hope that the message in this book, which is not just for Buddhists, but for all humanity, really echoes around the world. Thank you.
You need to come and present the book, or Mr. Habibullah, could I invite you to come and present His Holiness with a copy of his own book? I'm not sure he's seen it, but it's the official release function. We have such a distinguished panel of speakers that quite literally and truly they need no introduction. I think most certainly to people from anywhere in India or this part of the world, but I see several faces from outside India. So I will offer a brief introduction to our chief guest, Aruna Roy. She's a social and political activist who worked in the Indian Administrative Service, which is India's civil service, and resigned that to go down and work closer to the people of India. And with her husband, Bankar Roy, set up the Social Work and Research Center in Talonia. But she soon moved on, and with Shankar Singh and Nikhil Dev here, raise your hand, there he is, worked to set up the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, the MKSS in Rajasthan. And she was one of the founders of the Right to Information Act in India, which has had a very transforming impact on the nature of governance, of accountability of governance in India. And she was awarded the Magsaysay Award for Community Leadership, and was a member of the government's National Advisory Council from 2004, and from which she has recently, well, I wouldn't say resigned, but has declined to continue with the Advisory Council. And she is extremely well known as a person of integrity and a promoter of good causes, and standing up in particular for the underprivileged and the disadvantaged across the board. And she played a very major role in the National Advisory Council, particularly in looking at citizens' entitlements, and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was one of the major initiatives that she piloted and helped formulate and make real. So may I invite Aruna to say a few words. More than a few words.
His Holiness, Rajiv, Wajahat and friends, it's an honor to be sharing a stage with such an extraordinarily wise and young person, and who has so much to give to this world. The book that you saw in the hands of His Holiness, I've had the privilege of dipping into it and reading a few bits of it. And as a social activist, I was very excited to find that a person who is religious and who heads a religious institution should echo the words and feelings of people like me. Because we have, as lay people, opted to live and work with the underprivileged. We look at issues from their point of view and struggle all the time to get a more equal and more just society. And in that struggle, any voice that echoes and supports the predicament of people who have been pushed into poverty and pushed into not being able to access justice is an extraordinary feeling, gives you an extraordinary feeling of strength, warmth, and support. So I thank His Holiness for the book in which he has really expressed thoughts that will lead, if they are practiced, to a more equal and just society. He's talked about interdependence, and that's something in India we are quickly forgetting. We now forget that if you take more, you leave someone with less, and if you aggrandize land or electricity or any of those resources, you are taking away from somebody else. And the notion of a consumer society, which Mahatma Gandhi also talked so much about as being something that would really bring instability to this country, has now become the common mainstream position. And in that context, I think His Holiness's book, which talks about living on less and not being a consumerist, would really echo in the hearts of so many people today who feel that one person in a village in Rajasthan is expected to live on 147 rupees a day, which is the minimum wage that the government should pay. We don't even get that. And there are people who live on 50 rupees a month, an elderly person just managing to eat staple and chilies today. And on the other hand, we have places like this where you see affluence and you see well-being and you assume that India's growth rate is fantastic. So in this whole chasm between one part of India and the other, if we realize that there is interdependence and that we really do have to share this world and share it more equally and justly, we go back to the Buddha, but we also go back to this wonderful book which says the heart is noble. Of course, I don't and I can't speak about spiritual matters, but about practical matters and about issues which are both emotional and ethical is a concern of campaigns that are fighting, like Vandana's for food and other rights, and for people like us who are fighting for rights, for wages, for equality at other levels. It's extremely important to realize that these issues are common concern. I'm also very happy to note that this book is written in a contemporary idiom, because it's very important that for all of us, that we read in a language and an idiom which reaches out quickly to us. And if it doesn't, then we miss the wood for the trees. And it's a good thing that it's written in a language which is easy, which is conversational, and which really is comforting to read. But more important than that, one of the issues that has been raised and which is, I think, a great issue of concern for many of us today is that India, which gave birth to the Buddha and talked about compassion and talked about kindness and talked about well-being and talked about love, is now becoming more and more strident in its positions and intolerant in its attitude to differences in dissent, intolerant to different religions, intolerant to different strata of society, intolerant to women in the issue of gender, intolerant to Dalits. So the intolerance in India, instead of reducing as we progress more, is increasing. And therefore, the issue of tolerance, the issue of compassion, which Buddhism talks about so much, and which even many of our Dalits have found a refuge in away from Hinduism, speaks volumes, and this book echoes that compassion and the whole concept of tolerance. For me personally, the Buddha has been the first person in the world to talk of equality. And I think if I think of equality as a value, for me, the Buddha stands extremely high, large, and tall. And it's with the Buddha that the concept of equality, at least in the context of his life and his time, became extremely important. And today in this world, if we talk of equal share of natural resources, equal share of everything that will lead to a better life, we end up with a great deal of strife. So emotionally, and otherwise, and even politically for us, the Buddha serves as a figure of not only spiritual compassion and great learning, but also as a person who essentially understood the human condition which demands equality. I come from a part of the world which works for the poor, and my constituency is the poor. But I must say that the poor in India have far more compassion and far more sharing in their lives than we do in urban India. You go to a home in which there's barely one roti, and they'll share half with you. They go to a home where there's no food cooked and practically no food available, they'll still cook your meal. They'll never turn you out of their house without food. So these values exist in India. It's not as if they're extinct. But the thing is, we have to constantly remind ourselves that it's important that those values be brought back into the public domain, be made part of mainstream India. We think of the Buddha and Gandhiji and somehow establish them as values. In this consumption race, there are many battles that we fight, and I won't go into all of them. But that consumption will have to be limited, there is no doubt about. Whether it's climate change we talk about, or whether it's a range of issues, we really have to bring down our consumption levels. But what really made me feel extremely pleased was in the book, the mention of food, and how food and food systems are not only a question of distribution and question of hunger, but it's also the question of what you want to do with food. I'll just read a few lines from the text. Food systems are linked to our economic systems, and our economic systems themselves favor the rich over the poor. They enable those with more to benefit from the work of those with less. The rich may say that the reason poor people do not have enough is because they are irresponsible and lazy. I think, His Holiness says, I think the finger should be pointing in the other direction. The underlying reason for their poverty is that the poor have been marginalized. We have confined them to their poverty for our own benefit. And if this wisdom could percolate through to the people who govern this country, then India would certainly be a different place for the poor very soon. So I really think these issues go straight to my heart and would go straight to the heart of most people who struggle for food. And we are now struggling for a bill to be passed in Parliament which will give all the poor people access to food, universal food access, which is called the Right to Food Bill, which is still lying, and Parliament has still got to debate and finally pass it. In this entire range of issues, I won't go on. I would just like to mention one last issue, which also again reminds me of Mahatma Gandhi. His Holiness says that before we do anything, we'll have to develop our ability to listen. And I think listening is so very important for all of us, spiritually, practically, for economic reasons, for livelihood. We have to listen. And I remember reading Mahatma Gandhi, who said that if you do not listen, you can't lead. If you don't listen, you cannot take right decisions. And we've stopped listening. We've stopped listening to what is happening in this country. We've stopped listening to what we can see. And really, this is a very, very important thing. And I quote His Holiness again. He says, we can contribute to this shift as social activists by listening carefully before developing any plan to act. So all these apply equally to the practical life that I lead, and where I want people to have more food, where we want people to have more work, and a more equitable life in general. But I would say that for me, I too take away many things from this book. I take away a feeling of confidence, I take away a feeling of well-being, and I take away a feeling of blessing. Because if somebody who's on the spiritual path thinks this way, then we couldn't be very wrong. So I want to thank His Holiness for this book, which is an extremely valuable book, which I think all of us will read and all of you will read. And I take this opportunity thanking everybody here who has been responsible for getting me here and giving me the privilege of sharing the dais with you this evening. Thank you very much.
It equally feels ambiguous and inadequate in some ways to introduce the author of the book. But to stay with protocol, and I think that most of us are familiar with His Holiness the Karmapa. But again, there were a few people in the audience who I met outside and who seemed not to know enough, and you can never know enough about the depths of a great master other than what he embodies and what he represents. And I think it is in that experience and listening to him that we truly get to know about him, and that is inevitably circumscribed by where we are in our ability to receive profound and great wisdom. But at the more sort of, how do I put it, existential level of the current incarnation of a 900-year tradition, His Holiness the Karmapa is the head of the Karma Kagyu school, one of the four main schools of Tibetan Buddhism. He was born in the Tibetan Autonomous Region from nomadic parents, and at the age of 14 he escaped into India and sort of one day quite literally just showed up in Dharamsala, where he was welcomed and celebrated and endorsed once again by His Holiness. And certainly in the initial years, His Holiness the Dalai Lama played a fairly significant role in guiding the young Karmapas' education, and it has been the tradition that even reincarnate lamas have to go through the formal structured processes of education and complete the formal degrees and the formal certification that any monk has to go through. There is nothing assumed about the rigor of their training. He completed his studies in Dharamsala and resides at the Gyoto monastery in Sidbari, which is close to Dharamsala. And he has traveled twice to the United States in the West, and where there are monasteries and centers, of which he is the guiding light and spirit, and which were established by his predecessor. He has traveled within India, and in Dharamsala lives a very active life, giving teachings and granting audiences, and continuing with a very rigorous practice of his own. And I think that is, that's another remarkable feature of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that even someone like His Holiness the Dalai Lama at age 77, going on 78, continues to receive instruction and initiations from other lamas, despite being recognized as the preeminent lama of their particular tradition. So it isn't, as happens with a lot of sort of, how do I put it, contemporary or new age instant spirituality or instant teachers, that you have arrived and then you're all knowing. So the journey is a continuing one, the journey is an evolving one. And I think that the book is a demonstration of that engaging, of bringing traditional wisdom to evolve, and not just to apply it, but to be re-articulated to respond to to contemporary predicaments. So if I may invite His Holiness to speak to us, and for a long time, hopefully.
Tadi Karash Lab Dadia Kundre number Summer, the Kundre number, Lava to the Arunaji and the Rajiv Shetana Kundre number, Depeva. That's Hamalia Depevlia, Toshishatan, and a Samaria, some train.
First, I would like to extend my warmest greetings to all of you, our distinguished guests, and in particular to Ms. Aruna Roy.
Tamasi Kashureda Tang Ami says yes game in do Masi Trinity Des Kashre. Oh, a little bit tired, summer weather. Jazza and Maushna Shuas came into any 3D Kashureda. Mim number Lenge Maush Dep have a dig. Any Kashur. Assembly Mambus Pebtigi, Karchungorsana. 당에 대입티나로리아 지샤베 베나 다 지조 서머베 지조 내려 망부를 지여야래 제산 디들이야 지 참여기 심군능 예비치다 안다는 신 엔직 참여기 가서에 점링디 마음발이야 엔지 야부지야지다 안다는 지 심제 망부질이야 팬디 주야기 the culture took in Debarchi. You have the Sungu or Sungu, 3 Dusane, 디가라 가부시다 총송 드리두산 텔리앙의 미세 라투시샤인
It's wonderful to see that we have such an excellent turnout here for today's book launch event. Among various issues that I touch upon in the content of my new book, I take a look at various issues that relate to our society, and my perspective on these is such that I hope that I can offer some insight and inspiration as to how we can relate to these social issues, as well as issues that are relevant in our world at large, and also that I might offer some support and advice as to how we can all extend and expand our ability to bring benefit to as many living beings as possible. Apart from that, I don't feel that I have anything in particular to share with you today, but I would like to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to all of you.
아네 안다나 신기 소소 땅에 뎁디나로리아 시아르 소디 가르베다 interdependent somewhere also 참을로 다 지리 직되지 되버디 아니면 아주 지 가르베 아주 애네다 미 소소아 대양 안에 간다 교계 망부질이야 되지 아주 자신 소수지부기 정수고 토안에 안 초토야 매지 간다 애네 뭐고 현당 애네 조화신 다 망부질이야 되지 애네 가르베 아주 소초고 예지 드린주사 디균전 때네 아주 지 interdependent values somewhere that interdependent sadi that not just view somewhere that tawa jibo maimba that ethical thone shebina da and that is realistic somewhere we need to thone shebina what value ye debchi rintan ye debchi deni ju sane tigi denje da kanda da the group senan randu yana motivation senan randu awareness somewhere that ding out somewhere kwa de da kesh bistandu but chö nyamne sing sing bine randu dana shi jig activist din sing bine randu ya de ma be jidangi normal somewhere da the human beings senan randu yana garwe da citizen 지금이냐 다디 딘디지게 촌나로 거야디 개심시라 차디도 삼 등이스
As well, I would point out that in my new book, one of the main topics or areas of concern that I address is that of interdependence or interconnectedness. This principle of interdependence is one that describes the fact that we are all mutually connected to one another and to many things. That is to say that we exist within a pervasive human condition in which no one of us is purely independent. No one of us exists in isolation from anyone else, but rather we all exist and live in dependence upon many others and many other entities in our world. I think that in looking at this reality of interdependence, I hope that we can see the value of recognizing it as such, knowing that this is not merely a matter of a view or a theory that we might espouse, but rather it is a realistic and practical way of relating to our world and each other and our existence as it is by way of recognizing the profound significance of this interconnectedness. I think that we all need to engender a greater awareness or motivation that is based in understanding of this interdependent reality that we all share. And I say this in an all-inclusive way, whether we might identify ourselves primarily as representing a spiritual approach, whether we operate in the domain of activist causes, whether we are simply ordinary, normal human beings, or citizens of our society. However we might identify ourselves, I think that I feel very importantly that this is a very significant idea that we should all come to terms with.
Because interdependent yimi gyunsena tene nga tsugi ji didu samarwe dewa da rangda shengi dewa dungye changmo pinju jaba yedebchi ngal ya dungye yoade ya mishinda jil karwe shenda jaba yedebchi susola dewa yoade shenda jaba yedebchi indusane di gyunsen tene da dinjegi kar understanding of yondusane dene ngazula then karwe kali ji responsibilities are gengurti paji yondi yare then you sana ngazu choching da individual than the kaswada society somewhere individual society jaza individual the choice somewhere dangwa chia di society gi dangwa bichi 차용을 become like a society that choice 베나 차샤비임나 다 베스는 쉬비나 베나 디산 델릴리아 car 망고 싶도가 모터 망고 싶시 언디도 아니 모터 가시 알이야 미식스도 모터의 베 millions of 가져다 5 millions the day orders 모터 망고 modern 뉴드스는 오늘시나 individual choice를 차대요. 다디 영계 수수 individual choice. modern 뉴드스는 수수 individual choice in nothing related to other people. which similar to standing order. 다 이번에 선이 수수 뉴에샤 모더디다 랑가간이야. road 간 땅은 뉴드스는 안 데듀스는 신이 소수 모르니에디 소수 집이 choice 많이 봐. 다 society choice 임버지 동용과 가르스나 모든 여사는 로아디 지기 랑가디간 로그마도 소수 계획 랑가지요 말에 드네도 사네 에네 스톡차 안데 가르사디 디 가르사디 뭐라 제임스 가르사디 제임차 담제 안데도 사네 에네 신내지 social individual choice 되기 any societal affect 간데 연구해야지 아주 신기하다. 니두사 디균선 때에 아주 individual each and every individual this choice directly affect someone of that society directly affect 시기하래. 지사 디균선 때에 and responsibility 아주 디 interdependence at the understand 쉐베 토네 and responsibility 바지 용과를 쉐.
So by virtue of the fact of the interdependence that ties us all together, we need to recognize that our individual concerns relative to personal happiness or fulfillment, as well as the avoidance of suffering, are very much related to and dependent upon others' happiness and suffering as well. So these individual concerns as such are in fact shared ones that affect all of us in a collective way. I think that we need to understand or recognize this fact, and moreover, recognize that it entails an ongoing sense of personal responsibility to one another based upon that fundamental interconnectedness. As well, our choices as individuals, while we might conceive of them as such, in fact affect our society at a much broader level. To illustrate this, here in the region of Dili, there is a tremendous proliferation of automobiles. There are cars everywhere and the numbers are increasing. I understand that there are some 5 million vehicles out there, and people continue to purchase automobiles at the level of what would seem to be individual choice. We think of the purchase of a motor vehicle as a personal or individual matter, one of autonomy or choice as a consumer. But even while we might conceive of it in those terms, nevertheless, the repercussions or implications of such a choice are such that they extend far beyond the individual to broader levels of the society around us. We need to see that the individual choice that we might exercise in the purchase of a new motor vehicle becomes a choice that necessarily affects society as a whole around us. And we can understand this based on the knowledge that we gain in terms of how individual choices affect society at broader levels. Therefore, this principle or fact of interdependence or interrelatedness is one that has a direct relevance to our lives as consumers, wherein we make choices that would appear to be individual ones primarily, but which nevertheless carry implications that extend throughout society at much greater levels.
Andrew, that when we're talking about the responsibilities, and budget and compassion, loving kindness, that is okay. Not just like pressure, some of that. That be Gawadan, draw, Senator, Tangulam, voluntarily, some of the Degi, Toane, and Shelia, Pemberduaki, Sambachilia, the responsibility, and a champagne druaki. Nubachilia, Jurtubachala, Cargo Arsana, and compassion, loving kindness, that is Bugore. And the Indusane, the Junsel Dene, and a Kashwada. Azudi Bena Buddhist concept, Stone Shabby Minane, and a Chanju Samba Somroda. Chanju Samba Dizu game, Chanju Sembe game, and Jabba Takanda philosophical, some of that understanding the rich woman, philosophical, the Leben or brain or sometimes the rich woman. They put into heart some of that when a Lassam Namdak Ton and game curche, and a champagne druati, catch him shave on that Amatilla. Trinidad Junzen Dene, Mazuji, loving kindness Sadi, Keshim Chadi gave Trinidusane, Da Kanda. Okay.
So what I'm talking about here is a matter of responsibility. And along with responsibility, there are some other key qualities that are entailed, and these would consist in the qualities of compassion as well as loving kindness. Now, when I say that these qualities and the responsibility that comes with looking at the issues at hand, this is not to suggest that we should conceive of personal responsibility as some kind of undue sense of pressure or obligation to do something or conform to something, but rather a wholesome sense of responsibility in the ethical sense is one that is sincerely motivated by a voluntary sense of enthusiasm and joy to do what is good and meaningful, to develop our capacity to live in a way that is genuinely meaningful and beneficial to others around us. In Buddhist terms, we have the ideal of the bodhisattva, the courageous awakening being. And these qualities that we're looking at here are embodied by such an individual. But moreover, I would say that they are not a matter of mere philosophy as such, not simply intellectual or theoretical, but rather the true ideal of such a courageous awakening person is exemplified through a direct practical implementation of the very qualities that we're looking at here. And those qualities, among others, include those of love and kindness.
Sorry. That name, Tandona, yeah, Deb Dinanolia, Kajrata, Deb di Kaja Dinanolia, ne Xia Manguchi. That's also the Benang cannot chingiare. Nyanam Ju, the every day, summer, every day, almost every day, Mimang to the other. Mimang to the Manche, that Kajre, Dunge, Mimang was a Dunge Manguchi, but the same good Dunge, and the Lug Dunge, Takanda Chinanga Dunge Manguchi in Dusane, and the Zong Atuayonse, and Konanzu, Dunges and Andado, Ganges and Andado, Swat on Alshigare. This year in that Dijun Dene, Net have in a share of Sanglo learned from those people. Some of that. Honanzu Guni said David Matop and Arank Nguene, Mr. Takar. Tangi Sons very Kazali, Shirap Chimbo, Namju Chimbo, wide Jisons, very wide, very intelligent. I don't think like that. And the Industane, Honanzu Sheshavadi. Koranzu Jisung, telling you listen chap till dene, Kanda Kashwaji. Out Samingwene, and a shank Dungelia, Yakusin Yanguajidang, some ship Cheshe. Telia, Sumgur language, Kashmi, the Swana Chonsung, the Indus at Tigidi, Tagonal Jesh of Tre, the Nidu Dijunzen Dene, and D. When I have Yimina. Nye tepsur chago man tadi that those people somewhere that ngal jabiyo denge dizugi contribution of chadi ore jasange 고급 di gyuje kona samrulya tuchi shai.
In brief, in my new book, I address various topics of interest. And in looking at where these topics of interest come from, I have to acknowledge that in my ongoing experience, on a near daily basis, I come into contact with many people. And many of the people whom I meet come to me with various troubles. They experience all manner of different kinds of physical ailments and problems, as well as mental or emotional forms of distress and suffering, what we might call external as well as internal forms of suffering. Whether we call these hardships, struggles, pain, suffering, in any case, I become aware of what these people are going through by virtue of my coming into contact with them at a personal level. I want to stress that the content of my new book, as such, really derives from my experiences of coming into contact with and learning from those people. It's not so much that the ideas and topics of interest in the book are something that I contrived through my own insight or intelligence per se, but rather what I learned in my own understanding, I really gained from those individuals. And so it is important to take into account the suffering and hardships of others in order to develop a genuine understanding so as to experience empathy with others. So this is really not so much my book, but rather I have to say that the substance or content of the book really consists of the contributions that those individuals put forward. Finally, I would like to thank all of you sincerely for providing me with this opportunity today.
Wrong. No. Thank you for those people. Okay. No problem. It's good. Later we can fight. Okay. And tamadaliya de manguchi de pebiyare. And ganzu karwe. De pebdigi ngarang gelina support chayare. Tagane zo di ene ngege ta karwe goals ene miyu samarwe goal theda and ganzu goal di chigwe imbersi. Tene indusane ta miyu chigwe imbi indusane ngazu nyamdo be ruru chene ene chawa druba imbina ene karwe nzabuliya ji karwe more effective karwe da ji more effective tone and ji karwe da ene karwe positive change somewhere da yongya dinje wa chide and the indusane ganzo tosena shay.
It's wonderful to see so many people in attendance here at this event. I feel that yours is a very supportive presence. As well, I think that my goals or objectives are really commonly shared amongst all of you. Our objectives are really one and the same, ultimately. I hope that by virtue of the fact that we have the same basic concerns and interests, that we can promote a more effective approach to bringing about the fulfillment of all those tasks that lie before us in our world. It is my hope that we can effect more and more positive change toward that end. Thank you all very much.
I shouldn't really be juggling these papers for notes to introduce the next two speakers, because they're both dear friends of mine. And how do I put this? Celebrated activists, celebrated author, and people who have manifest a deep social concern and have manifest the kind of activism that has been discussed and talked about and His Holiness has pointed to. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Vandana Shiva. an anti-globalization author, but as Aruna mentioned too, looking at issues of food security, which have a substantial space in His Holiness's book, and she's an environmental activist. She's a board member of the International Forum on Globalization, a member of the International Organization for Participatory Society, and she has worked very hard for changes in the paradigms of agriculture. I know I once interviewed her for a television program, and it was a 20-minute program, and I said, look, I cannot continue talking about all the things that you have done because it would have taken up the entire 20 minutes of the program or the remaining time here. But just to say that she manages and funds the Research Foundation for Science, Technology and Ecology, and which has led to the creation of Navdanya, which is a national movement to protect ecological and agricultural diversity. And she has been called an environmental hero by Time magazine, delivered lectures on ecofeminism, has also won the Right Livelihood Award and the Sydney Peace Prize, authored 20 books, and so I could go on. But meanwhile, I will hand over the microphone to Vandana. Vandana will read for us some extracts from the book that she finds moving and transforming.
Thank you, Your Holiness, for this beautiful gift. We needed something that connected the deepest values and stirrings within each of us to the challenges we face in India, around the world. One of the challenges, of course, is total ecological disaster. 40 years ago, I got involved with the ecological movement through CHIPCO. Some floods had taken place, some landslides had happened, nobody had died. But the women of CHIPCO were saying what you have said so beautifully in your book. Let me read it. I have noticed that sometimes people speak of our planet as a thing. This attitude will not lead to the feelings of closeness and affection that would move us to take care of the earth. As we know, the earth is not a dead rock floating in space. It is a living system in itself as a whole and in each and every part. I do not see the earth as an inanimate object, a lump of stone. I think of it as being alive. Sitting on the earth, I feel that I am resting on a mother's lap. It is thanks to her that everything exists. In this way, we could easily think of the earth as a goddess, a living, breathing, and constantly giving goddess. And because we are managing the earth as if it was lumps of stone, that we have the disaster in my region, Uttarakhand, where 100 people have been killed. I'm born there. I've watched it get devastated. You build a road. I mean, they want to build 8-lane highways for that automobile culture. 8-lane highways to where we did penance in Badrinath and Kedarnath and Yamunotri and Gangotri. These are not picnic spots and holiday camps. They are places of pilgrimage. And those roads have left landslides, and those landslides get triggered with the first rain. If you all remember, monsoon floods came at the end of the monsoons, not on the first 3 days. So the carelessness with which we have dealt with the earth, and you have pointed it out so beautifully in environmental protection, stirs my soul. But also, your remarks that the core message of your book is interdependence. That same 40 years ago when I joined CHIPCO, during my holidays, I would give to CHIPCO, but the rest of the time I was working and slogging on a very difficult PhD on non-separability in quantum theory. Your teachings of interdependence are now the teachings of the best of science, that the world is not separate, dead entities. It is an interrelated, interconnected living system where the tiniest impact in one part of that system has huge impacts on the rest of the system. That is why they talk about the butterfly's wings causing a storm. And these are the reasons why we call Gaia Gaia. We talk about ecology as the web of life. And because Chipko was a woman-led movement, and in those early days, in the 70s, you know, the feminism was replicating the worst of patriarchy, in the sense you wanted to be as successful, as careerist, as much of a climber in the political or economic ladder. And that was the kind of issue that you're touching on that initially used to worry about rights when talked about in connection with women's rights. And then you realize the exclusion and the suffering. And then you started to redefine women's rights as human rights. But what I absolutely love is this lovely paragraph. In my own personal case, I do not always feel clear about the distinction between masculine and feminine qualities. People have told me that I'm more feminine qualities than masculine. I do not know what that means. I just have a sense of that these qualities feel like, but I have no label. I simply experience them. And because, as you've said, gender seems to define our place in the world, but it's just a construct, it's just an idea. And you have deconstructed it so well and so beautifully. Gandhi, too, every day in his prayers said, "Mujhe aur istri mein banao," make me more womanly. And just like there is interdependence in the world, these fluid identities are part of what we need so much, because it's not just fixed but fragmented identities that are behind so much of the violence within our own societies, or what's happening in Syria, or what made the Arab Spring an Arab nightmare. It is all about manufactured identities being taken as real and then being put in competition with each other. You have talked about greed as the big problem of our time. And you have talked about how much destruction it is causing. Your paragraph that begins with, "We are like children trying to grab anything that comes our way," is in fact an indicator of moving beyond this culture of greed, whether it is as consumers or it is as appropriators. You've said greed is ridiculous, making us grab at things like babies grasping for a rattle. And we need to mature as human beings. You talk about the limitless potential we all have to move beyond consumerism as the only project for humanity. And I'm so glad this book came out of your conversations with young students, and you were thanking them, but also the people who come to you with their pain and suffering. That becomes your teacher. But it would really be useful for the Indian youth who are so charmed by consumerism and so high on it just now, to be able to benefit from your teachings. And definitely we at the Research Foundation in Navdanya would like to do our bit to make sure your book, as well as your teachings, reach wider. You talk about greed being counter to interdependence. Awareness of interdependence helps us counteract greed, because greed only arises when we treat ourselves as fundamentally independent and disconnected from others. With greed, we see ourselves as not only separate from other people, but even in competition with them. The most important words in greed's vocabulary are my and mine. If we look at what underlies greed, we can find a fundamentally self-centered fixation on our own interests. And For me, this my and mind reached the limit when some companies started to say they had created life. They were now the owners of seeds and plants. They could claim invention and through that patents. In '87, when I first heard that vocabulary of me and mine for the beautiful gifts of creation, that's the day I decided to start Navdanya and start saving seeds as a gift. And that's what we've been doing now for the last 2.5, 3 decades. And I remember when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was celebrating his 60th birthday, I was asked to give a talk, and I talked about what to me is the intimate link between spirituality and our world, the gifts of creation. And I talked about patenting, and I talked about genetic engineering, and His Holiness put 3 lines on a piece of paper for me, which are there in all our publications. Every being has a right to happiness. No being has a right to cause pain and take away that happiness. And to me, the violence we are committing to the earth and all her beings, to the seeds of the future, to agriculture, is the violence that can only end, not from the heady kind of analysis, but what you have defined as cultivation of new feelings for the earth. On page 87, you have said we have so much knowledge, we have so much information. We human beings have tremendous intelligence, but it is clear that there remains a big gap between the brain and the heart. We seem to find it easy to process new information and generate new ideas, yet much harder to produce new feelings. Although we readily recognize the import of a situation conceptually, somehow this understanding often fails to move our heart. Our intellectual intelligence doesn't transfer into intelligent emotions, and our heart and brain seem to remain a world apart. What we now need is to go along with all our powerful new ideas about the environment are powerful new feelings. They're ways of thinking about the earth that go beyond just acquiring knowledge and actually lead us to feel deeply for our physical environment. A sense of wonder and appreciation of the earth's beauty is a helpful place to start in developing strong feelings for the environment. My life has been inspired by exactly those feelings of beauty, which then translate into the search for truth, into science, into research. And over the last few years, we've been developing a compassionate agriculture in place of the violent agriculture that looks more and more like war. And in your chapter on food justice, you talk about healing the cycles of hunger and harm. You talk about how food brings home all we have discussed of the earth's great generosity, as well as our intimate connectedness to the world. Each meal we eat arrives on our plate through long, complex networks involving many people, many plants, many animals. The clouds and the soil also join in, and in fact, the whole planet contributes to create the food that we need to survive. Far-reaching chains of interactions form systems that make our food available to us, meal after meal, our whole life long. So I feel blessed and honored that I'm here to say thank you to you, but to say thank you to the soil, to the seed, to the sunshine. We've had the privilege of having the Tibetan community with us for training them in this nonviolent, ecological, compassionate farming. Some of them are here, and right now we have about 20 people from Bhutan to translate Buddhism into the way we relate to the land. And Navdanya has started this year, this connection that you're talking about, of cultivating this love for the earth through gardens of hope, where we become one with the earth, with the soil, from the little child in nursery in school to the old person in a retirement home. And Your Highness, Your Holiness, I would like once again to say we are here at your service to spread your teachings in the world. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Vandana, for so eloquently contextualizing the teachings, message, and writings of His Holiness the Karmapa to your own work and to the larger agendas. I'm delighted to welcome Pavan Verma, who studied history at St. Stephen's College, was an outstanding student, and was a member of the Indian Foreign Service, where he served in Moscow, New York, the Indian Mission in the United Nations, in London, where he was director of the Eclectic Nehru Center. He was India's High Commissioner in Cyprus and has been India's ambassador to Bhutan. He was press secretary to the President of India and Director General of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. But above all, he's a wonderful human being and has been widely published, best-selling author on a range of books and issues, from Mirza Ghalib to portraits of different facets of contemporary India and its heritage. I'm delighted to welcome Pavan.
Thank you, Rajiv, Your Holiness, Aruna Royji, Mr. Vajayat Habibullah, Dr. Vandana Shiva, Miss Newberry, friends. It's been a truly elevating evening to listen today to the elaboration of the book of His Holiness and his own speech, which was so moving and came from his heart. In my years as ambassador in Bhutan, I had occasion to very closely personally interact with a certain form of Tibetan Buddhism and to try and understand the motivating human dimensions of a religion. What is my takeaway from this important and moving book? That takeaway is that there must be a nexus between spirituality and compassion. Many of us may see that as axiomatic, but it is not always so. I am a Hindu and I am profoundly influenced by Hindu metaphysics and philosophy. But sometimes I feel that in its ritualism, Hinduism fails to show, for instance, sometimes the kind of compassion religion should have. Sometimes Hinduism degenerates into becoming more a quest for individual moksha and less the pursuit of compassion affecting society as a whole. People will go to one of the richest temples in India and put money and gold and silver in a hundi, but be oblivious to suffering and deprivation, sometimes visible just outside. Or walk on the ghats of Varanasi without seeing the filth, the pollution of the river itself, take 3 dips, pray for their personal moksha and move on. They are in a sense practicing spirituality, but without the great animating resources of compassion that must move it. That correlation has to be there. And from compassion, that's another takeaway, Your Holiness, from your book, there must come awareness. Spirituality must nurture compassion and compassion must awaken awareness. The ability to see around you with that compassionate eye, otherwise compassion means nothing. Awareness is also not axiomatic. Sometimes I feel in India, we don't see anymore, we don't notice. I had written some years ago a book on the Indian middle class, and I can say, Your Holiness, one of the great, for all its other buoyant energies, one of the great limiting factors of the middle class, of the educated, is their inability to see, to notice. A foreigner sometimes notices poverty with greater sense of awareness than someone who is educated in India. It is almost taken for granted. And that is why we have the juxtaposition of five-star hotels and slums. Because those who often go to it may not notice it. So awareness is also not axiomatic. But if there is spirituality and there is compassion, and that compassion leads to awareness, then that awareness should lead to action. Which is again what your book, I take away from it. That none of these, although important in themselves, are important unless all three lead then to action. It is a very important quantum jump from feeling to doing. It is often a barrier in our lives. We feel but we don't do. Again, after writing the middle class book, because I used to lecture across India, and many people in the middle class then used to ask me, okay, what difference does it make for my contribution? What can I do? So, somewhat misguidedly, Your Holiness, I wrote a book called Maximize Your Life, an Action Plan for the Indian Middle Class. Of the 19 books I have written, Your Holiness, this is the book that sold the least. Because people will profess a sense of feeling. People will even express a sense of outrage at the absence of other people having a sense of feeling. But people will not take that quantum jump from feeling to doing. So it must lead to action. And action naturally needs direction. So it's a linear progression: spirituality, compassion, awareness, action, and then action in the right direction, for the right priorities, for the areas that affect people, in areas that matter the most. That kind of direction, we have such eminent social activists here who have shown the direction. So that direction needs to come, and again your book is a pointer. One great project, Your Holiness, that remains unfinished in India is the project to create a more caring and concerned society. And I am sorry to say that although its role is limited, the state has done nothing to engender or promote it. In fact, it looks upon those who actually seek to begin the process of, for instance, forming a group or an NGO, as almost trespassers onto monopolies that the state alone should have. Instead of an encouragement, there is almost a resentment. If you look at our laws relating to charities, you will be amazed how they are so created that except for such tenacious and persistent activists like Aruna Roy-ji or Vandana, most people will be left asleep at the post. Cumbersome procedures, unhelpful bureaucracy, overlapping laws, administrative hurdles, time delays. One particular, I'll not name the state, till recently I was in government, now I'm in public life, but one of them said that if you have a budget in the year of 1500 rupees, you must present an audited report to that particular commissioner of charities. The preparation of the report is more than 1500 rupees. So what I'm saying is we need a more enabling environment to encourage the creation of a more caring society. I have an economic principle that no policy which is motivated by altruism in this country at the government level will ever succeed if we do it in an uncaring society. Some way or the other we'll find a way to subvert it, or subsume it, or divert it. So therefore, this is a project that must be completed, and everybody who can contribute is a role model. Your Holiness, I'm sure your book will inspire people. And unlike my failed book, I know more people, many more will read your book. And I hope they take away from it this message, that all of us have a role to play in the creation of a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavan. I should add that Mr. Verma has resigned from the civil service to become the cultural advisor to the Chief Minister of Bihar. What can I say? It has been such a illuminating, wonderful evening, and I think that my takeaway from His Holiness is that it's far more important to be the human being that he is, as is to manifest in action. Because ultimately, if we can dissolve, and His Holiness talks about this eloquently in his book, our sense of self, of the I, me, mine, in the activism that we process, I think the more effective we can be. And I think that it is in who His Holiness is, as much as what he does and what he says, that we learn from him. In fact, he says in his book, "In my present situation, I have nothing tangible to give back to anyone. People often come to me with high hopes for what I can do for them. Mostly I have one simple thing to give. From my heart, I offer them my love and my hopes for their happiness. And very often, merely the aspiration, and not all of us are capable of the kind of action that the activists on our stage who have spoken are capable of. And I just find His Holiness's words irresistibly empowering and moving. He goes on to say, "I want to share with you a feeling I have. I feel that my love does not have to remain within the limitations of my own life or body. I imagine that if I am no longer in the world, my love could still be present. I want to place my love on the moon and let the moon hold my love. Let the moon be the keeper of my love, offering it to everyone, just as the moon sends its light to embrace the whole earth." And he concludes the book, and that's probably sort of the most appropriate way to conclude the evening. "I mentioned before that we can make others the keepers of what is precious for us when I spoke of wanting to let the moon keep my love. Since the moon is holding the love I have for you, seeing the moon can remind you of that and inspire you. If anything I have said here makes sense to you, you can ask the moon to keep it for you. You can ask the stars to keep it for you. When you look at the moon and the stars, I hope you will be reminded of the thoughts and the love that I have shared with you here. Your Holiness, I can assure you that these thoughts and feelings and the power of who you are and the compassion that you manifest has been a transforming time and experience for us, and we're deeply grateful. Thank you.